after the event. The link for the recording will be up on our YouTube channel probably by the end of the day today. So you can look for that at youtube.com/Villa Athenaeum, but I will also email that link out to everyone after the program. So today we have Ed Snyder with us to talk about Monument Cemetery. It seems cemeteries are very popular around here. We've done a couple cemetery themed programs in the past, and they've always been really popular. So it's really exciting to have Ed with us because he used some of the Athenaeum's collections for this event. And part of the point of our afternoon programming is to highlight those collections that we have here, especially ones that researchers are using, regular everyday people, whether you're just someone who likes old buildings or you're a scholar, everyone can use our collections for something. So Ed, if you'd like to get started, if you have questions, you can ask in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll do a Q&A at the end. So, all right.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I am seeing Tessa's video getting a little jittery right now, and she was losing audio. So let me know if there's any problems from my end, please. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Tess. Thank you to the Athenaeum for hosting this presentation. I'm Ed Snyder. I've been writing a blog called The Cemetery Traveler for about 10 years now. And one of my early topics was the destruction of Philadelphia's Monument Cemetery, which happened in 1956, and the subsequent dumping of the gravestones into the Delaware River. I have been giving this presentation off and on over the years. What you'll see today has been updated with some new material provided by the Athenaeum. The books, periodicals, and other reference material from their vast holdings has helped me to get a better understanding of what happened to Monument Cemetery. So I hope to share some of that with you today. Without further ado, let's dive into the Delaware River and have a look around. I am going to share my screen. And Tess, do you see my lead slide okay?
Yes, looks good.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we just about covered that. I will mention that down toward the bottom above the yellow hosted by Athenaeum of Philadelphia line is my Cemetery Traveler blog URL, cemeterytravelerblogspot.com. I've been writing this for about 10 years. And there are, I think I posted 4 separate articles on Monument Cemetery back around 2012 and 2013. So Ben Franklin said, show me your cemeteries and I'll tell you what kind of people you have. And what we're going to talk about is photographs like this that I've taken under the Betsy Ross Bridge. We'll talk about the history of the aftermath. I should go back just to mention this photo of me in the Delaware River is I'm sitting on a gravestone looking out at the New Jersey shore. So in front of me is the riverfront under the Betsy Ross Bridge in the Bridesburg section of Philadelphia. I have an antique iron ice hook in my hand because I do not go exploring abandoned sites or areas without personal protective equipment. So it's not an easy location to get to. It's not altogether safe. So if anybody is interested in seeing that, just be prepared. Okay, so Monument Cemetery was the second Victorian garden cemetery that was established in Philadelphia 1 year after Laurel Hill. 1837 is when the cemetery was established. Père Lachaise was the first garden cemetery that started the whole trend of a rural cemetery outside the city with an arboretum, a sculpture garden, and that sort of thing. Angel statues, a pleasant place to be buried, a pleasant place to visit. So right after Père Lachaise, Mount Auburn in Cambridge, Massachusetts was established as the first Victorian garden cemetery in the U.S. Laurel Hill was the second. I'm not really sure if Monument was the third in America, but it was established a year after Laurel Hill. Philadelphia historian Tom Keels wrote a book on Philadelphia area cemeteries, which we'll talk a little bit about as we go on. His writing is what really piqued my interest. And I think in his book is where I first saw this photograph of the central monument being dismantled. John Elkington was the originator and proprietor of Monument Cemetery. And he said, various indeed are the reasons why a city is an unsuitable place for a cemetery. And the reason was because the cities were grimy, noisy, the Industrial Revolution, sooty, a lot of blue collar work. People needed to get away on the weekends and go to a quiet place. There were no parks, there were no museums. Cemeteries served that purpose. So Monument Cemetery, like Laurel Hill, served that purpose. It was in rural Philadelphia. Right now, if you know where Temple University is on North Broad Street, that's exactly where Monument Cemetery was. That was outside the city limits in 1837. And this is what the entrance looked like to Monument Cemetery. This was the lovely Gothic gatehouse that John Sartain designed. And this is from one of the newspapers from the Athenaeum's collection from 1852. And it was absolutely a beautiful place. So some of the other information that I got about Monument Cemetery was from the Pennsylvania Historical Society on Locust Street in Philadelphia. Their librarians are not nearly as helpful as those at the Athenaeum, but they do have information if you know how to get it. They had a lot of annual reports from Monument Cemetery with maps and advertising and things like that. And the book that you see with the leaves, The Cemetery Traveler, is the most recent book that I had published. If you want to read more about Monument Cemetery, the essays from the blog are published in here in this book, and it is available on Amazon.com. So originally, Monument Cemetery was called Père Lachaise after the Parisian cemetery. And we see here that it was about 1.5 miles up Broad Street from the center of the city, sufficiently remote to prevent the apprehension that it may ever be encroached upon by our growing population. No one thought that the city of Philadelphia would grow past what is Cecil B. Moore Avenue right now, but it did. Just to give you your bearings here, if you know where Temple is, over on the right where I've written Broad Street, Paulette Walk is right alongside Conwell Hall, where Temple University is. You could see off to the left, Berks and Montgomery Streets, Norris Streets. If you're familiar with that area around Temple, you know the names of these streets rather well. And Monument Cemetery took up about 12 to 15 acres directly across the street from Temple. So long story short, Temple University was growing into a commuter college and desperately needed parking. So here is this kind of useless old cemetery across the street, and they spent about 20 years off and on trying to buy the property to make a parking lot. They finally succeeded in 1956. We'll get into how that happened, but it is now a parking lot. So Elkington had worked with a Renaissance man, essentially John Sartain, to design this this gorgeous piece of architecture here, which was also destroyed. John Sartain was a publisher. He was an artist and architect. He was an entrepreneur. He ran a magazine. And was one of Edgar Allan Poe's friends, and really tried to get Poe published. Never succeeded in doing that, but he helped Poe along the way to publishing fame. So I mentioned Tom Keel's book, Philadelphia Graveyards and Cemeteries. This is one of the early books that I came across probably 15 or so years ago, maybe 20 years ago. And the last chapter in the book is called Vanished Cemeteries. I was absolutely intrigued by this. Like many people, I wondered, how could a cemetery vanish? Why would a cemetery ever be abandoned? Questions people ask me all the time. So one of the sections in the book was about Monument Cemetery. And he had photos of the, or a photo, I think, of the gravestones at the river's edge. So I got in touch with Tom and I asked him how to get there, and graciously he gave me directions. It is not easy to get there, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Monument Cemetery the name was changed in 1869 when this 70-foot monument to Lafayette and Washington was erected in the center of the cemetery, which was also designed by John Sartain. There is a Sartain Street that runs north and south through the city, no coincidence. So in a book called Philadelphia in Slices, also from the Athenaeum's holdings, we see this article, near the city we pass the cemetery, a newer but beautiful spot, with its interest greatly detracted from by the fact that adjoining its very walls are the grounds of a public house, and much frequented by the frolicsome young bloods and loose women who travel this road to the falls and Wissahickon. So you could see by 1848, the city had grown well past Monument Cemetery. The city was growing rapidly. This is John Sartain from his autobiography, and he talks a little bit about how he was trying to get Poe to publish Annabel Lee in his magazine, which never actually happened. This is Sartain's monument. John Sartain was buried at the center of the cemetery. All of this stuff that you see, the monuments, probably the bronzes, statuary, were either smashed up or dumped into the Delaware River. So you can't really hang around cemeteries without learning something, I found, whether it be about architecture, history, religion, society, science, yourself, whatever. Jill Lemin Lee, librarian at the Athenaeum, came across this article for me. I was intrigued by this, $10,000 worth of silks. This is from 1865. $10,000 worth of silks and laces were found secreted in a vault in Monument Cemetery. The covering of the vault had been removed and stolen goods tied up in bundles tumbled in upon the coffins. So that just seemed odd to me. $10,000 worth of silk. How much silk is that? You know, would silk have been really valuable back then? So it turns out that in 1865, or prior to 1865, there was a worldwide silk shortage. There was a disease that ran rampant, an epidemic that was rendering silkworms across the planet unable to spin silk. So it turned out that the price of silk skyrocketed and probably became more valuable than gold. So obviously someone had stolen silk and thrown it into one of the crypts for safekeeping temporarily until they sold it on the black market. So I did a little research, and it turns out in 1865, that is when Louis Pasteur got involved in trying to figure out what was going on with epidemiology. And he solved the problem of the disease that was plaguing the silkworms. And single-handedly, he saved the silk industry for the planet Earth. He had such luck with silkworms that he then decided to move his research toward humans and more directly helped humans by discovering vaccines for such things as rabies and anthrax. Another article Jill found for me, which was didn't have quite as happy an ending as the previous one. Samuel Connor, a wealthy gentleman, owner of considerable mining property in the West, principally in Colorado, committed suicide in the Monument Cemetery, Philadelphia on the 22nd by shooting himself through the heart. He had been married the day previous. And that is from, what year is that from? 1886. All right, so life goes on. Monument Cemetery grew, became a very popular place. 28,000 burials in this 12 to 15 acre area. So one of the reasons that cemeteries become sort of stagnant, if not abandoned, is because they get filled up. So Monument Cemetery filled up in 1929. So they'd been in business since 1837. And guess what? If you have no room left to bury people, you have no income. So you've got trust funds and things like that. You barely have enough money to mow the lawn. So as time went on, the cemetery became a little bit run down. And from about 1928 through 1955, Temple tried nonstop to buy the property, but the owners would not sell. They were not satisfied with what Temple had planned for reburial of the human remains. This was not unusual. All over the United States, cities were growing after the turn of the century, and it was not unusual to move cemeteries. So this is from a different cemetery in the Kensington area of Philadelphia. This was typical around the country, happened a lot in San Francisco, happened in New York, happened in Philadelphia. So imagine you did not visit your grandparents for, I don't know, a couple years, and you decided one Sunday to go visit their grave and take your kids, and you got there and you saw this sign. Give you a moment to read that. Imagine how you would feel. And then you're probably wondering, when was this sign put up? Am I too late? Do I have to move the graves at my expense? What if I don't move them? So Monument Cemetery was in a similar situation. The security was not very good. The money was running out. Vandals were knocking over tombstones. And Temple went to the city of Philadelphia using information like this as evidence to condemn the cemetery. They couldn't buy the cemetery, so they worked with the city to condemn the cemetery so that Temple could, at some point, gain possession of it. This is what the remains of the cemetery looks like right now. So if you're on a boat on the Delaware River under the Betsy Ross Bridge looking at the Philadelphia shoreline, this is the Bridesburg section of the city. Gravestones litter the shoreline for the length of about a city block. If you look up on the embankment to the left, one of the really shocking things for me was hiking through the woods and getting to the riverfront, climbing down this maybe 12 to 15 foot embankment and realizing that this was a man-made jetty alongside the canal, or Frankfort Creek rather, that is probably entirely made of tombstones. So one of the reasons these were all dumped here was to be used as a foundation for building the Betsy Ross Bridge. You can visit, you can see this. It's not easy. You need specific directions. There's fencing. From time to time, it'll be fenced off, so you have no access. People cut holes in the fence. People do this, they go out fishing, not necessarily to look at the gravestones. But people from Philadelphia have seen these as they've grown up. There have been stories about this since the 1950s, and every few years, new information kind of leaks out, and then there's a resurgence in interest. So when I started publishing these photos and writing about the gravestones on my blog, there was a resurgence of interest. And one of the things to remember if you do go out there is you have to consult the tide tables for the river, because at high tide you cannot see the gravestones. They get covered up. The water rises about 6 feet. So here's Temple University. I went to school, went to classes there. One of my children, actually 2 of my children, went to Temple. Conwell Hall is here. If you look directly across Broad Street from Conwell Hall, sorry. If you look directly across the street, you'll see what used to be Monument Cemetery. It's a recreation center and a parking lot right now. Originally, Temple's founder, Russell Conwell, was buried along with 28,000 people in Monument Cemetery. His grave was, and his wife's, were ultimately moved across the street so that they're buried now behind Conwell Hall. So Temple wanted the cemetery, and they did whatever they could to get it. And like I said, they convinced the city that it was a hazard to have this. So they condemned it, probably acquired it through eminent domain, gave the owners a certain amount of money, and the city paid to have the bodies moved. So where did the bodies go? 28,000 burials. Who knows how many families? You know, could have been 15,000 families. I don't really know. Letters were sent out to 748 parties of record, so 748 plot holders, and 400 of those replied, 300 of whom met to vote on which cemetery they would want their ancestors moved to. So this accounted for about 20,000 bodies, which were ultimately moved to Longview Cemetery in Northeast Philadelphia at the city's expense. Another 8,000 out of the original 28,000 were supposedly moved with private funds by families. So if you wanted your loved ones, your ancestors, say 10 graves, moved to a different cemetery, you had to pay for the removal and the reburial. You had to buy new plots. So supposedly about 8,000 people were reburied at other cemeteries. 20,000 were buried in a mass grave in Longview Cemetery in the Rockledge section of Philadelphia. So here's an article that says by the summer of 1956, the clearing of the cemetery was well underway. Temple stated that this will provide, it's an old cemetery, and this will provide much needed parking space by fall. So a lot of people are appalled by this. I get hundreds of emails and comments on social media about like how this could possibly have happened. And obviously this sort of thing could not happen today. I'm sure everyone's got a lot of comments and opinions about that. It just seems to me that a lot of people didn't care. You know, this was a post-war society. The nation was growing. Who cares about an old Victorian cemetery? Apparently not a lot of people did care. Those that did, those 300 people that voted to have their ancestors reinterred elsewhere, obviously they did care. How they were reinterred, your guess is as good as mine. There are records that state that certain things were done in a certain way by the book. If you read this article, it says the huge operation started 6 weeks ago, will continue until the latter part of September. Clearance of the 118-year-old graveyard will make way for a public rec center, blah, blah, blah. Workers are armed with blueprints showing the exact location of each body. After the bulldozer removes the grave's concrete marking slab, the men dig carefully with shovels to recover the remains. Eyewitnesses who've responded to my blogs have differing opinions about how that was actually done. Not so carefully and not so scientifically. If you think about it, to move 28,000 graves in 6 months with 25 workers and 1950s technology, steam shovels and cranes and bulldozers, right at the top there, a team of 25 workers. Do you think 25 people could move 28,000 bodies very carefully so that they know exactly what they're pulling out of the ground? And when they rebury them, they know exactly who goes where. So here's a photograph from a newspaper of removal of the remains. Does not look like a very careful operation to me. When I started posting these blogs on the Cemetery Traveler, I got hundreds of comments from people all over the US and people who had ancestors there too, who've never been able to find them, any trace of them since the cemetery was destroyed. I'll read this to you. It's a comment from my blog. I was a Temple student when bodies, that is remains, were removed from monument. Even then, Temple was a commuting school. It was private, not a state university. Not all gravestones were removed. I remember marble ones being smashed to pieces by workers with sledgehammers. I also remember wooden coffins being opened by workers with hooks. The high water table had flooded these coffins, and what remained of the bodies were extracted. I assume the wooden coffins, or what's left of them, remain underground to this day. So it doesn't sound like a real careful operation. Anyway, looking across the street from Conwell Hall, where I have the white arrows, you notice those stone walls there at the left and right? Those are those stone walls that were the original entrance to Monument Cemetery on either side of the gatehouse. Why they left the walls there is bizarre. But on the left is a parking lot, and on the right is an athletic field and a recreation center. So usually when cemeteries are plowed over or demolished in Philadelphia, they just pave it over and build something on top, like a playground or a parking lot or something like that. They don't dig down deep to put a foundation for obvious reasons. They found that out when they did the excavation for the building of the condominiums at 3rd and Arch a few years ago. If anyone knows about that, the First Baptist Cemetery of Philadelphia, the graves were supposedly moved to Mount Moriah Cemetery in Philadelphia in 1863, I think. Well, when the drills hit the soil and bones and skulls and coffin fragments started flying out of the ground, people had second thoughts about what happened there. When archaeologists went in there after the dig was temporarily stopped, guess how many bodies in coffins? This is not pieces. This is entire skeletons, human remains in coffins. How many do you think they found? Not the leftovers. They found over 500. All right, it's another photo of the wall. and a little statement about perpetual care, which doesn't really mean a lot to the plot holders at Monument Cemetery. So what I wanted to mention to you related to the gravestones at the Delaware River shoreline is that these pieces of history, these personal statements, evidence of people's existence still exists there. Probably only in granite forms, only the granite gravestones. So if you want to use hard stone stones for a foundation for a bridge, you're not going to use marble, which is porous, which is probably why the workers smashed all the marble stones up. So granite is a lot stronger. As tragic as it is for a cemetery, this is a recent comment from someone who wrote to me on social media when I was advertising for this particular talk hosted by the Athenaeum. As tragic as it is for a cemetery or cemeteries to be destroyed, we in the US are not accustomed to our lands being torn apart by wars and desecrated as Europe and other parts of the world are. It's quite an emotional feeling to me to know they existed. And although startling to see a monument where it is, it's not destroyed as it could be. So some people, think that it might have been, a little more palatable if the stones were just pulverized and destroyed, not just to be left like that out in the open. So with Tom Keel's help, I was able to find my way to the shoreline. I was there a number of times. This is the Betsy Ross Bridge on the Philadelphia side, and there's woods that go on for about maybe the length of 2 city blocks onto what is a jetty, essentially. Once you get to the end of the jetty and you climb down to the riverfront and you look back behind you, this is what you see. So that jetty seems to be composed of granite coping and gravestones and other parts of monuments. People have seen my blogs and asked me if I'd seen this name or that name. There's a veteran of the Civil War whose stone is buried here. Photo shows him at the time of his enlistment in 1861. He had gray eyes, brown hair, light complexion. This was a human being. This stone is probably the only evidence of his existence at this point. I point this out if you look at the reference, Valerie Morrison. She is a Philadelphia area psychic who, after seeing some of my photos and the blogs that I wrote, went to the riverfront with her crew in hopes of starting a movement to move all the stones to a better place. Never happened. These stones are all on private property. But what she did is, with her researchers, she researched and published on her website histories of all the people whose names are written on these stones that I photographed at the riverfront. She had CBS News down there at some point, whenever this was, 2012 maybe. Old cemeteries can give people a sense of the land and place where their ancestors lived. When no photo of a long dead ancestor exists, a photo of a gravestone can illustrate a family tree. So someone asked me in a blog post, in a comment, is there any possibility that the books of recorded burials might be put into the database of the Find a Grave website? Well, not really the books. There are grave records at the Pennsylvania Historical Society. But the names and the photographs of the stones for Monument Cemetery on Find a Grave had no entries. While their graves may never be found, their information would be of great interest to family historians and genealogists. So that was a really good point. So what I did is I went back at one point to the riverfront and cleaned off as many of the stones as I could find that had entire names and dates and other inscriptions. I transcribed those and probably about 40 people altogether photographed the tombstones and posted the information on the Find a Grave website. This is another person who Valerie Morrison wrote about, Mary Ann Lehman. She was married to a sea captain and lived in Philadelphia. It's a friend of mine walking along the riverfront. You see an old newspaper photograph from a Philadelphia newspaper with a green monument in Monument Cemetery, and then you see a green family monument on the left at the riverfront. The names would be obscured until the next low tide, but because of current public interest in what happened to the cemetery, their memory lives on in ways they could never have expected. And it's true, you know, whether you think this is a good thing or a bad thing, people need tangible proof of their, you know, ancestors' existence, and a tombstone is a very powerful thing. The Victorians felt that you needed a tombstone in order to be admitted to heaven. It was like your ID. If you didn't have a tombstone, you didn't get into heaven. This was an intriguing one. According to the New York Times, Babel Irons, which is a great name, was a captain and probably died in a shipwreck. This is his wife's gravestone at the riverfront. I got a comment. Zorobabel Irons was a distant cousin of mine, and I have come to this article in the process of doing family tree research. It grieves me to learn that Zorobabel's and Mary's remains and gravestones were treated with so little respect, but I thank you for honoring them in this blog post. So where are the bodies? This children's gravestone, obviously many children were buried in Monument Cemetery. Infant mortality was much higher back at the turn of the century than it is now. Someone asked a question, where are the babies that were buried there? And there were so many of my family. Well, the mass grave is at Longview Cemetery in Rockledge. It takes up about the size of 2 football fields. Now, it looks like a flat mowed lawn, but if you look at it from profile, you'll see very subtle ridges where the trenches were dug for the remains to be buried. Every once in a while, there's a flag or a bronze plaque or something like that, but there are no gravestones. Supposedly, if you go there and you are a family, a family member and heir to somebody that was buried originally at Monument, they will look it up in the book and take you out on the lawn and point to a spot and say your great-great-great-grandfather is buried right there. So who knows if that's true. Another newspaper photo of John Sartain's grave. He was supposedly moved to Mount Peace Cemetery in Philadelphia. I was there with about 4 Mount Peace workers last year and failed to find any grave that, certainly not his monument, but there doesn't seem to be any sort of grave marker. So in summing up, I wanted to show you this photograph and read to you something that someone had written to me, which kind of summarizes everything, maybe better than I could say, you know, as far as what happened to the cemetery, why it happened, and how we should feel about that as a society. Thank you for sharing the story, one that needs to be told. Cemeteries are supposed to be memorials for those buried there. They're supposed to be a collection of biographies, an area filled with stories to be discovered. It's not just the granite and marble stones, but the stories behind them. Unfortunately, for those whose lives meant nothing to them, the decisions of some led to an atrocious, disgusting, and thoughtless act of incomprehensible disrespect. As a result, the last mention of existence and the stories that could be told for these people are hidden beneath a bridge and the waters of the Delaware River. Shame on you, Philadelphia. So it's all about respect. You know, we choose when to show respect for our history, for ourselves, and when not to. Here's an example of a grave that's well kept in a nice cemetery, a cross, some flowers, a wreath. This is a dog's grave. This is in a pet cemetery that I photographed last year. So think about that, you know. Some graves, like Mary Irons, are just lost to history. I'm doing my part in trying to keep that alive and to try to keep this, you know, in people's consciousness, so that, you know, we think about, you know, things that we did in the past that were not so great. You know, we're not as fine a people as we think we are, or we like to think we are. And again, my book, Cemetery Traveler, is available on Amazon if you'd like to read more about Monument Cemetery. I'd like to thank Jill Lemin-Lee at the Athenaeum for her extensive help with gathering some of the material for my research. And I will take any questions that anyone has at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. We have lots and lots of comments. People in the chat have been going back and forth about, you know, their own, whether their own relationships with Monument Cemetery or other cemeteries or other bodies that have been moved, and complaints against Temple. We've got everything going on in the chat here. Just to go back to make sure I understood correctly. So if someone was buried in that cemetery, where would be the best place to go to find that information?
So the best place to go to find the information would be the Pennsylvania Historical Society at 13th and Locust Street. They actually have the books that are the burial records.
Okay.
I do not know if Longview has copies of those, but they at least would have copies of the records of who was reburied at Longview.
So, yeah, so at Longview, they might only have the ones that are there. They might not have the people who aren't there. Makes sense. And it looks like some people are saying that it might be on ancestry.com as well, but we'd obviously have to check that. And then also, unrelated sort of, I live next to what used to be the John Sartain Elementary School. Oh. Now it's the Sartain Apartments, but I never knew who he was really. I never looked into it. So now I know. That's pretty cool.
Very, very famous guy.
Yeah, that's really cool. Nice to know more about that. So one person says that they have family who were buried in Monument Cemetery after 1929. So I don't know if that person wants to show us the the proof, but I guess they claim burials did happen after 1929.
So we do have, there is an inconsistency in records that I see at a lot of cemeteries where if a cemetery says no, well, I'll give you an example. Historic Laurel Hill Cemetery is full.
Yeah.
But they still bury people. And the reason they bury people is because there are family plots. Oh. And if a family has, say, 5 empty spots left in the plot, they could continue burying, but the cemetery might not be opened to the general public for burials. So that would be my guess.
Full could just mean there's no plots for sale, too.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. One question is, what was the largest cemetery relocation in Philadelphia? Would this be it? I would assume so.
No, actually, if you that's not really a shocker, right? This happened all over the world. In San Francisco, they moved 1 million people out of cemeteries. 1 million remains to the outskirts of the city. But I believe the largest relocation of a cemetery in Philadelphia was down by Pat's and Gino's cheesesteak emporium, the big athletic field that you see right across the street with the baseball and gardens and basketball courts. That used to be Lafayette Cemetery. And that was moved. That was really a criminal activity, actually. What was compared to what happened at Monument, Monument was totally above board. What happened at Lafayette was, I think it was about 46,000 graves, probably twice as many as were in Monument, were moved. And the city paid somebody to move the bodies and didn't really ask where they were taking them. Well, they went out to the suburbs and they buried them in what later became the Neshaminy Mall. So in the 1970s, when the first bulldozer started plowing up ground to build the mall, they found where the guy had taken the bodies.
Wow. Is there any kind of like historical, the markers the historical commission makes? Is there any kind of marker on Temple's campus for the cemetery?
That is an excellent question. No, I do not believe so. Temple stays very quiet on this subject.
Yeah, it made me think, the students who, are playing in that rec center, do they have any idea what is underneath? Maybe it's haunted and they don't know why.
Well, I think someone had commented recently when I was advertising on social media this particular talk, talking about all the gravestones in the river. A woman wrote, if you ever wanted to make a river haunted, this is the way you would do it.
Well, if anyone on here is a historian, maybe you guys can team up and get that historical commission marker. I don't see why we shouldn't have one.
If the walls are still there.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought of, because it reminds me of Moyamensing Prison.
Yeah.
There's just really a wall. That's really all that's left. And
right. Yeah. Why not at least a plaque?
Yeah. Right outside our office here, we have one for the Walnut Street Prison. So we like those. Let's see. All these questions are kind of. Well, someone just asked about Mount Moriah Cemetery.
Anything in particular about it?
Is there any? I know
still
that there are unmarked
exists.
graves there. I know. That's where. Isn't that where H.H. Holmes is buried? That's my information.
He's not buried there. He's buried over at Holy Cross Cemetery in Derby, or Yaden. Yeah. So I'm actually on the board of directors for the Friends of Mount Moriah Cemetery. So we've been working for about a dozen years now, since 2011 when the cemetery was abandoned, to make the cemetery cleaner, safer, restore a lot of it. And one of the things that I realized early on, someone figured out that if there's an unmarked sort of open area of the cemetery, where are the graves? Are people actually buried there? Well, the tombstones fall over or they get knocked over. And over the years, they're underground. So people go around on a routine basis, digging out the gravestones, resetting the headstones. And we've probably done hundreds of those. So there are, sort of unmarked graves, but that's only probably because the gravestones had fallen over and gotten buried with, dirt and sticks, leaves over the years.
Do you know where the Sartain Monument is now?
No, I've never seen any brownstone at the river's edge. Brownstone's soft, just like marble. So my guess is that it was hacked up and probably just dumped into the Frankfurt Creek or something like that. I did ask at Mount Peace, as I said earlier, I tried to find the actual grave because supposedly there is a plaque of some sort in the grass, but neither the workers nor I could find that even with maps, unfortunately.
Someone asked, what's the oldest gravestone you've ever found?
The oldest? probably near my house at the Old Swedes Church in Queen Village. I think the two oldest gravestones certainly in Philadelphia, are in that small cemetery. And I think they are from maybe 20 years before Philadelphia actually became a city. I forget the dates. It might have been like the 1690s or something like that. Mm-hmm. And they're made of green soapstone, which is an awesome material. Huh. So I just saw someone in the chat asked about Mount Vernon Cemetery in Philadelphia. So I wonder if there's any way to save the chat and like there is, over time I could maybe answer questions and you could publish that somehow. Mount Vernon Cemetery
automatically change it, so save it. So, yeah.
Okay. So Mount Vernon Cemetery is actually in the process of being not necessarily taken over, but at least cared for by a new friends group that has been formed. So I would think that within a year from now, there'll probably be some progress in, maybe not restoring, but at least keeping that cemetery from, further degradation.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of comments in the chat of people who went to Temple and did not know that there was ever a cemetery there. So we can assume.
I really am interested in people. A couple people have contacted me who were students at the time that the cemetery was destroyed. Mm-hmm. I would certainly like to, talk to people about their experience. And I cannot imagine that was a pleasant time because it happened in the summer.
Oh.
and you're excavating thousands and thousands of graves in the summer. The smell could not have been very pleasant.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't even thought about that, especially since they're so old. I wouldn't have thought that would have been an issue. Gosh, I really can't keep up with the chat. People are talking so fast. Let's see. Well, someone asked what the name of your book was again. It's the Cemetery Traveler, right?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's called The Cemetery Traveler, the same title as the blog. If you type that in with my name on Amazon, the book should pop up. Thanks.
When I send out the link to this recording, I'll put the link for the book in there as well. So,
all right, thank you.
Yeah, it's easy enough.
So someone did ask or said it was a shame that Temple didn't keep the gate from the cemetery, which that certainly would have been awesome. They actually did something like that with a different cemetery in Philadelphia. I forget which one that was moved out around Wayne. And I don't think it would have ever occurred to me to do that, but they actually did do that. They took the original gate from the old cemetery, and it was installed in the new reburial site.
So someone asked, how much do you think the dumping of the stones was to build up the embankment of the new channel, as opposed to just dumping them?
I think the ones that were dumped just to get rid of them were dumped into Frankfort Creek, because I've spoken with people that grew up in Philadelphia, and they remember as kids seeing a lot of that, which have probably all been covered over, with dirt and trees and stuff over the years. So probably have no idea where those things are. But the plan to build the bridge was well underway, so they needed to create a solid base with what's called riprap, which is just old stone from excavations and from demolition. So granite was a great thing to use. So the bridge didn't actually open until 1976. So that was a good 20 years that it took them to build up the shoreline, build this jetty, and build the foundations.
Mm-hmm. It seems in some of your pictures, it seems you can still read a lot of them quite well, but over time, the water will wash them all away, I'm sure, some of them. But
The gravestones?
Well, some of them, you know,
Well,
so read them
well,
quite well.
what happened? So I was really kind of shocked at how new the stones look, because granite, you know, does not fade like people's memories do. The stones, some of them that are just sitting there on the waterfront, that were probably carved in, maybe 1918, you know, something like, they look brand new.
So
And
sweet.
it's really shocking. You would think they were just done like last week.
Yeah. Here's a good question. Tell us about your tie.
It sort of matched my shirt. It kind of looks like mausoleums in New Orleans, doesn't it? No, I think it's just abstract building. I like architecture.
It's on theme, you know. So many of these. Yeah, I've never had so many people in the chat just like chatting. So I'm like trying to keep up with the conversation. Sorry about that. Oh, Mount Moriah participates in the Amazon Smile program, so you can help give them money through that. That's nice. Lots of people saying they want to come back to Philly to see all of our cemeteries.
They are gorgeous cemeteries. If you like Victorian cemeteries, Laurel Hill is beautiful. And a lot of people ask me, you know, where my favorite cemeteries are, and you know, you would expect
dietary supervisor, please.
Sorry about that.
100-8787 stat.
I work at a hospital, so the emergency messages come out over the telephones. So, you know, people think about New Orleans, or they think about, you know, Philadelphia or New England. Most gorgeous Victorian cemeteries I've ever seen are in Baltimore. So if anyone wants to see really nice cemeteries near Baltimore, please check them out.
Yeah. I wouldn't have thought to go to Baltimore for a cemetery.
No, nobody does. So it's not safe. You know, the great old cemeteries are usually like what's now the middle of the city, you know, inner city. Historic Laurel Hill Cemetery 30 years ago was not a safe place to be. And also, Baltimore, same deal with Greenmount Cemetery. That was not a safe neighborhood, but they are unlike Mount Moriah. They are staffed with security, and they're very safe to go. If you do go out to Mount Moriah, just, you know, when the gates are open, you know, it's perfectly fine to drive around or walk around, but realize there's no security, and it's not really staffed. I see someone mention Chicago. Chicago is one of the few places that I've never been to see the cemeteries. I do want to get there. I do travel around the US a lot. And somebody mentioned Loudon Park Cemetery in Baltimore. Yes, that gets my vote as one of the best places in the country. But I've been all over, and I've written about a lot of cemeteries, photographed them, and researched them. So it is interesting.
I love the information that people are coming to this event with. That just talking about Baltimore, John Wilkes Booth and Edgar Allan Poe were both buried in Baltimore.
Yes, that's another reason why I want to, you know, archive all this chat, so I can learn a lot more than I do now. Thank you, everyone.
All right, well, it is 1 o'clock, so thank you everyone for coming. Seriously, there's still so many questions that are coming in. I just couldn't keep up with everyone, but so I will be sending this video out. So if you want to share it with anyone, you're more than welcome, and I'll send you the link to Ed's book and his blog as well. So thank you again, and hopefully your next research project will come back to the Athenaeum.